Good morning, my name is Cesar Iliano and I am the Content Director for BNamericas. Today, we will be presenting the main findings of our 2022 Oil and Gas Survey Report, which was produced thanks to the participation of hundreds of industry executives and in collaboration with Deloitte and ARPEL, the Association of Oil, Gas and Renewable Energy Companies of Latin America and the Caribbean. Sebastián Pérez Ferreiro, our managing editor for news, will be going through the key conclusions of the report. Then, Michael Place, BNamericas regional energy editor, will be moderating a conversation with Carlos Garibaldi, executive secretary for ARPEL, and Luiz Eduardo Rubiao, partner for infrastructure and capital projects at Deloitte, Brazil. I would like to remind all attendees that you are in listen-only mode. You can ask questions using the space at the box in the right hand of your screens. I also want to remind all BNamericas clients that you can read and download our oil and gas survey report from the report section in our platform. So I now leave you with Sebastián.
Thank you, Cesar. Despite an ongoing supply chain crisis, a war on Europe's doorstep, and a global economic downturn, the investment climate in Latin America's oil and gas sector is generally brighter than it was a year ago. That is the overriding consensus of respondents to the 2022 BNamericas Oil and Gas Survey. Around 42% of those surveyed said they expect higher capital spending this year, up from 33% that forecasted a year ago. More of the survey's participants predicted higher capital spending on decarbonization and digital transformation projects, while over 50% projected busier exploration activity during the current calendar year. But these figures don't tell the full story. There was also a series of warnings raised by sector stakeholders, several of whom expressed concern about equipment delays, difficult access to capital, and escalating political risk across the region. Nearly 99% of those surveyed said they had been affected by the supply chain crisis, with 49.5% describing the impact as major. Likewise, nearly 99% said they expect the situation to continue for the foreseeable future. In a year of presidential elections in Brazil and Colombia, it is of little surprise that regulatory and legal instability continue to be seen as major threats to regional oil and gas investments. 37% of the survey's respondents rated political risk as the biggest obstacle facing the sector over the next 12 months. Next was resource nationalism with 29%, followed by supply chain bottlenecks and future waves of the pandemic. More than half of the respondents said they would not raise capital through debt or equity financing over the next 12 months, with many pointing to adverse macroeconomic factors and growing pressure on institutional investors to drop fossil fuels from their portfolios. The 2022 Oil and Gas Survey was carried out between June 29th and July 21st and received 217 responses, the majority of which were high-level executives, senior managers, and commercial representatives. Service and equipment providers accounted for 17% of total survey participants, ahead of consultancy firms, mid-size or junior operators, engineering companies, major operators, contractors, banks and financial service firms, and government entities. Colombia is the best represented market, with 49% of respondents saying they have investments or operations in the country. It is followed by Peru, Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Ecuador, Brazil, and Bolivia. We're now going to be joined by Carlos Garibaldi, Executive Secretary of ARPEL, and Luiz Rubiao, an infrastructure and capital projects partner at Deloitte, for a discussion moderated by our energy editor, Michael Place. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Sebastián. Welcome, Carlos and Luis. Thank you both for joining us today in this discussion. Well, we'll begin with the questions. There we are. We have all the cameras turned on. The first question I'll direct to Carlos, and then perhaps Luis can answer after Carlos. Some 42% of those surveyed said they expect a jump in capital spending in the next year, up from 33% that predicted an annual rise last year. This comes despite concerns about the global supply chain crisis and a general sense of growing political instability in the region, particularly in Colombia and Brazil. Are you, Carlos and Luis, well, first Carlos, are you surprised by the positive capital investment forecast, and what, in your view, is the reason for it?
I'm not surprised. In a nutshell, the reasons are the perception of a higher oil price plateau and the related extension of the war in Ukraine, resulting in the need to replace Russian oil and gas in a status quo that is evolving from episodical to structural. But I shall elaborate. There's a prior history. For the past few years, capital availability for oil and gas has been shrinking due to growing societal pressures. Banks have customers, shareholders, and other stakeholders like everyone else. But in addition, there has been a self-inflicted retreat from exploration. This retreat was motivated by peak demand, apprehensions to some extent, but mainly by diminishing returns in exploration due to the maturation of the traditional basins, while pushing the envelope to more challenging and expensive plays such as subthrust, deep water, subsalt, high pressure, high temperature, the Arctic, etc. Also, the shale phenomenon in the US deterred many players from international deep water exploration. Guyana and Santos basins are both regional and global exceptions. The drop in capital expenditure in E&P was already remarkable before COVID and the war in Ukraine. From 500 billion in 2019, we went to 350 billion in 2021. And keep in mind that oil and gas needs to invest at least $400 billion a year for 10 years just to maintain production. This slowdown caused not replacing enough produced production at the same time that global economic growth fostered growth in demand, thus increasing oil prices even before the Ukraine disruption. But this last dislocation has put a spotlight on energy security. The new price, possibly plateau, encourages capital deployment to replace fuel supplied by Russia to international markets. Latin America still offers significant untapped resources. The resource potentials of the Mexican offshore, the Atlantic margin from Guyana to Brazil, the pre-salt in Brazil, and Vaca Muerta in Argentina are quite compelling. Moreover, Venezuela may unthaw in response to lost Russian supply and insist on the lion's share of South America's oil and, most importantly, natural gas. And Trinidad and Tobago has idle LNG capacity. And you mentioned political instability, and there's another question on that, but that's almost idiosyncratic to the region. It's nothing new to the initiated.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Some interesting points and a positive outlook for Latin America from ARPEL's perspective. Luiz, what are your thoughts about the positive capital investment forecast for the next year?
Yeah, actually, first of all, good morning to all the attendees, and thanks a lot for the invitation. I think, Michael, that I agree with Carlos with what he said. In taking a look at the Brazilian scenario, I think that it's not surprising for us to have this change in the let's say in the positive way, because what we are feeling today is that there is really a kind of interest in developing different and diverse situations here in Brazil. For instance, you have the Santos Basin, where it's really where we see a kind of very concrete movement in terms of new investments from Petrobras, new FPSOs. We have the Campos Basin, where we have a kind of different movement, where we see some new entrants coming to, let's say, replace Petrobras as the operator of major fields. And we also see potential new frontiers in the Brazilian shore that can become, let's say, new Eldorados for oil and gas. Some people would think that, oh, this is kind of crazy since we are so constrained, or at least so under pressure because of the, let's say, the decarbonization movements. But in a certain extension, I think that it's not a kind of conflict, because in the short term, the renewables, they are being explored in Brazil. Brazil has a kind of big effort to make the renewables something truly concrete. But in short term, there is no other way. We have the reserves, and I think it happens with the other countries in Latin America, and they will be explored. And this is exactly, we now have a kind of sense of urgency because of the war in Ukraine, Russia in Ukraine. And I think that this put all the world under pressure. And the fact is that in Latin America, we may have some areas that are kind of in a very good situation if you compare to the rest of the world.
Very interesting. Thanks for that response, Luiz. Positive outlook for Brazil too, by the sound of it, despite some of the concerns, the global and the regional concerns. Despite the positive outlook on capital spending, only 1 in 5 entities is planning to raise capital through debt or equity in the coming year, with many citing adverse macroeconomic factors. And as Sebastian mentioned in the presentation, pressure on institutional investors to divert from fossil fuels. Meanwhile, 38% foresee financing conditions worsening, up from 33% last year. Do you both see a lack of financing as a major challenge for the region in the coming year? Perhaps, Carlos, you can begin.
Okay, yeah, it seemed to me rather curious that some 42% of those surveys say they expect a year-on-year jump in capital spending, and only 1 in 5 is planning to raise capital through debt and equity. So I think that the confusion is crystal clear. But yes, lack of financing is a major challenge indeed. The demand of energy transitions has caught societies by storm now and affecting credit to the oil and gas industry. As you know, the IEA said to call them to end upstream investments, period. And multilaterals and banks are aggressively curtailing their exposure to oil and gas in their portfolios. Like I said, financial institutions face their own stakeholder pressures, and plus the boundary conditions on their portfolio risk imposed by their regulators, reputational risk included. Thus, access to debt capital is getting harder and harder for pure black oil players. This is despite the fact that both oil and gas play a significant role in the energy matrix, even in the most aggressive net carbon zero scenario and for decades to come. So that's curious. So believing in the law of gravity, I think it should compensate eventually. There is certainly a tension between energy security and energy transition, but it's not an inherent dialectic dichotomy. They're not mutually exclusive. It is a transition and not a replacement, like many people say. It's an and not an or. So I think the strategy of capital asphyxiation of our industry and the resulting energy price increase supposedly help leverage renewable energies. But I think that's short-sighted because it places an additional cost burden that is critical for the development economies. For example, Latin America generates only 4% of carbon emissions and has the urge to monetize their hydrocarbon resources to lift broad swatches of their populations from poverty. Why should it foot the bill? Besides, every time that we jump off the treadmill and curtail E&P investment, we hit a price wall that affects the cost of the entire industrial chain, from fertilizers to cement, steel, and consumer products. So developed countries feel the inflation pain too. Going back to the E&P financial issue, like I said, we all know that there's no decarbonization scenario that can afford to exclude oil and gas from the energy matrix. Energy security concerns should mellow the attitudes of investors and their cost, and investors towards fossil fuels. And many companies are doing the job, and they're promising decarbonization or net zero by 2050. So I think the ones that can adapt and strive to be cleaner will likely get the funding. The key thing is transparency. Transparency with regards to the ESG impacts may help with financiability.
Thanks, Carlos. It sounds like adaptation will be key. Luiz, as Carlos pointed out, many companies are expecting an increase in capital spending in the next year, but very few are saying they will raise capital through debt or equity. Does that suggest that there is a difference between what companies want to do and what they can do? And what are your views in general about the financing market in Latin America for oil and gas?
Yeah, I think that the last phrase of Carlos summarizes very well the situation. I think that no doubt that the oil and gas companies, they are kind of interested in moving ahead and investing in some new ventures and having new FPSOs, expanding the production and so on. But for sure, there is this, let's say, I would say a fear from the financial institutions, because there is this kind of stamp of oh, we are talking about something that is not kind of in accordance with the decarbonization view. But we have a lot of let's say phases to go through before thinking about net zero. First of all, I think that when we are talking about oil and gas, we are talking, for instance, about gas, and we are talking about the production of fertilizers in Brazil. We are not only thinking about energy, producing energy. We can use the natural gas to be a kind of ally of the solar plants, also the eolic, the wind plants. So I think that there are some steps where we can have a kind of perfect match of the oil and gas with the renewables in some sense. When we talk about, let's talk about the really dark side of the oil and gas production. Even in this area, I think that we can do a lot. We can, for instance, we can think about energy efficiency. We can think about reducing or even more eliminating any kind of flaring in the units. We have a lot of things that are, let's say, in the process side of the production that can be improved, and that can give a kind of comfort for the investors to, let's say, to be willing to participate in this challenge that we would have, I would say, short term. And as Carlos said also, I think that transparency is everything now. I think that we need to see very, very clearly that, okay, we may not be in the, let's say, in the green production when we are talking about oil production in Santos Basin, for instance, but we are having a kind of footprint that is not that bad if you compare to the rest of the world. And the fact is that we have a kind of competition all over the globe, a lot of sites where you can produce oil, where you can produce gas. And the fact is that I think that the people say, oh, the strongest they will survive. Actually, the ones with the smallest footprint in terms of the decarbonization evaluation, they will be the ones that will be preferred. So I think that there is a lot of things that we can do in order to give the investors the confidence to really, let's say, allow the companies, the operators, or to have the money available for the ventures they are thinking about.
Excellent. Thank you, Luiz, for that response. You've both touched on the energy transition and the importance for oil and gas companies to start thinking a little bit differently and become more transparent and to adapt. The survey results provide evidence that is happening and that the companies are embracing a clean energy transition. 42% of respondents say their entities are planning to increase decarbonisation investments year on year in the next 12 months compared to 36% last year. I think Luiz mentioned flaring, reducing flaring. What other types of low carbon initiatives are companies investing in the region? We can, I guess, think about carbon capture and storage, renewable power generation, improved operational sustainability. Perhaps, Carlos, you can share with us some of the initiatives that you're seeing at ARPEL.
Yeah, I will address those, but first I want to follow up on an excellent point that Luiz made. Decarbonization is both a challenge and an opportunity for the E&P industry. And the obvious thing that we know that natural gas stands at the intersection of energy security and energy transition. Exactly. It offers the best synergies with renewable energies because of its inherent flexibility, It provides leverage for their full development because it has an interruptible basis to power systems. So also it's a mature and proven technology that's resilient along the value chain. It can also associate with hydrogen via blue conversion, blending, and infrastructure sharing. We know that renewable energy capacity is growing by leaps and bounds, but jumping from a very low basis. Until renewable energy generation and storage take a quantum technological leap, I think gas-driven thermal power will likely be here to stay, providing an interruptible basis. Because when there is no rain, sun, or wind, we're still there. No, natural gas is still here. I think it's urgent that for the financial situation, that in the political, financial, and popular cycles, natural gas needs to be reclassified and not put in the same dirty bucket as fossil fuels with coal and even with oil. On the other hand, I think to be fair, gas producers must focus on reducing their carbon footprint by minimizing methane emissions via, and this is part of the energy transition, via efficient energy systems, pneumatic controller, vapor recovery, leak detection and repair, reduce venting and flaring. And that brings us back to transparency. Transparency with regards to ESG impacts, health, financiability, as I said. But apart from natural gas, many regional companies are diversifying their portfolios. And going back to your question, with renewable energies and other decarbonization efforts, some are derivatives from their traditional core competencies, such as carbon capture, underground storage, geothermal, offshore wind, and blue hydrogen. But others are undertaking solar and wind farms, lithium mining extraction, second-generation biofuels, green hydrogen, and even reforestation. And I think it is happening in all our member companies. All company members of the association are doing something about it, are diversifying their portfolio, and they're venturing. Our industry needs to also incorporate other necessary competencies through industrial collaboration and partnering with renewable energy firms. So I think there's room for more alliances. In fact, we work side by side with our member companies to transit this required transformation. So our member companies can adapt to a world of energy transitions and new risk dynamics. And excuse me for the commercial, but in fact, this is the theme of our conference in Lima on November 14th to the 16th.
No worries. Thank you very much, Carlos, for that. Luiz, what are you seeing in Brazil? What are companies doing, oil and gas companies, to reduce their carbon footprint there?
Well, before going straight to your question, I just want to reinforce what Carlos was saying, because we talk a lot about, oh, let's think twice about exploring oil and gas, but the fact is that here in Brazil, when you take a look at the energy sector, I would say that it's not the biggest, let's say the worst villain in the history, in the story, because we have other types of emissions here in Brazil that could also be treated by the country. But besides this, when you think about energy, we still have some coal thermoelectric generators here in Brazil. So it's crazy to think, shall we think about oil and gas for the thermoelectric production, power production? Well, we still have coal. We still have kind of 6-7 units in Brazil that are using coal. So I think that sometimes we lose a little bit. We are not thinking about, let's say, the priorities, So I think that when we talk about gas, we have a completely different scenario when you think about fuel oil, or even worse, coal. So I think that it can really be a good ally for the renewables. But coming back to your question, I think that it's not only the flaring reduction that is the center of the attention. I think that we have a lot of other initiatives. We think about electrification of some units. Instead of having, I'm going to use I'm going to produce energy here inside a platform the way it's possible for their platform. No, we can have a kind of scenario of having a kind of power supplier for a set of platforms. We can have a specific platform, one specific platform supplying energy to a set of other platforms that are operating close to this, let's say, power generator there. So we can think about ideas where we can, let's say, optimize and work pretty deeply in the process side to improve the performance of that specific unit. But we have a lot of other initiatives. Nowadays, people think about, okay, we have a turbo generator and we are burning gas and we are producing CO2. Let's get the CO2 from the turbo generator and inject in the field again. Oh, let's try to export this gas to the continent and explore let's say, the new natural gas market that was created by the Brazilian government, and let's supply not only the thermoelectric generators and also other customers in the country. So I think that we have a lot of initiatives that are kind of concentrated in the process improvements, that are concentrated in the, let's say, the business improvements, and exploring the potentiality of some of these products like the natural gas. So I think that working in these areas, I think that we open a very interesting door for, let's say, at least some more years of, I wouldn't say a green use of oil, but at least a cleaner use of oil that is good for the economies here in Latin America. I agree with Carlos. There is no reason for us to pay for the global bill, especially when we have some oil reserves here that are kind of explored with a reasonable performance and a reasonable footprint at the end of the day.
Thank you, Luiz. Some interesting reflections there. I'd just like to remind our audience that if you'd like to ask a question, you can do so on the top right side of your screen in the control panel. Our next question relates to risks in the sector. Most of the survey's participants cited political upheaval as the biggest threat to the sector, but there are also concerns raised about supply chain bottlenecks, future pandemic waves, weak demand, and financing difficulties, which we've already spoken about. How do you perceive risks in the region, Carlos, and what are the biggest threats for the coming 12 months, in your view, for oil and gas in Latin America?
Well, I think that political risk, it's curious for me that so many companies rank political risk, and that doesn't correlate very well with the actual investments. But political risk, one of the reasons is that political risk is a very broad term. If we talk about political upheaval and ideological pendular swings, that's nothing new in the region or to our industry. The pendulum has swung wildly quite a few times, and many countries in the region have cycled around liberalization, petronationalism, and pragmatism during the last three decades. For one thing, countries have the right to set the rent sharing as they please. And that's the price signal they send out, and companies are free to go and invest or not, and maybe take the money somewhere else. But 90% of zero is zero. So there is a self-regulating balance there. The real problems with political risk, to be more precise, are contract instability and juridical instability. Those are the most detrimental risks. The sanctity of pre-existing contracts and the free disposition and transfer of earnings are paramount. So those are I think the real red lights, and not results of elections. But fundamentally, I think that the main drivers for investment are prospectivity and future oil price perception. Besides, our projects typically span over a quarter of a century, and normally the independents are more sensitive to these risks, to the shorter term or the medium term, but the major companies can afford to focus on the prospectivity price signal rather than the political noise. It is also a fact that politicians often campaign in verse, but once they're in power, they may find out that they must govern in prose. And things change. They have been creative solutions. For example, we have one example of acreage nomination process for licensing with a twist. The first hurdle being the carbon neutrality plan, even ahead of mentioning the exploration commitment. It sounds strange, but it's a brave new world for us. And I think that's a brilliant example of adaptation to the zeitgeist.
Thank you for that, Carlos. Luiz, what in your views are the biggest risks facing the sector, perhaps with a Brazilian perspective over the next 12 months?
Yes, I think that, again, I think I agree 100% with Carlos. I think that, honestly, there is nothing new in the horizon. There is nothing new. No matter who wins the election here in Brazil, it will be someone that is already known by the market. And what we have seen, I would say at least for the last 3 decades, is that we changed from centrist governments to leftists and rightists. It doesn't matter. I think that the oil and gas market was surviving during this period, and I think that it will keep going the same way. So I don't see this as obviously there may be a kind of adaptation in the beginning of a new government or in the transition, but I don't see this as a kind of, I wouldn't say even midterm problem, so I don't think this is a big problem. And I would say I would go even beyond Brazil, because I have been in touch with some colleagues from Deloitte at both Colombia and Argentina. We're scheduling a visit to both countries. In the perception there, and we have kind of a special situation in Argentina and a kind of special situation in Colombia. Well, obviously, we feel a little bit of we are a little bit concerned of how this will evolve, but I don't see a kind of position of, there will be no further investments or there will be a reduction in investments. It's just a matter of adapting to the new situation in moving forward. The subject of discussing renewables, for instance, in Colombia and even in Brazil, we discuss this. This is something that needs to be discussed. Renewables, they came as a kind of permanent subject, and we will need to face the major oil companies. They are already facing this, and I would say in a very elegant way. They are kind of transforming themselves into energy companies, not oil and gas companies. And they are thinking about, okay, let's explore oil and gas as much as possible, and let's start to play with the other alternatives. So I don't see this as it's really much more a matter of having a good structure in the countries than I think I talk about Brazil. Brazil has a good structure in terms of the technical resources, in terms of a kind of community that was constructed along the years in the oil and gas sector. So if we have this structure, if we have this organization, I don't see a problem, even if we have a kind of change in the government, or if we keep the same government. I think that this cannot be an obstacle. And I think that more and more, I think that the Latin American countries, they need to go on the road where where the society will be less dependent on the name or the party of the president. This is something that has a kind of tradition here in the region for a long time, but this is something that, in my opinion, is becoming something new. I think that we are in the process of changing this, and I think that more and more we will be kind of non-dependent on the presidents.
Thanks, Luiz. Well, actually, the responses in the survey back up what you're saying. Despite the elections in Brazil, most of the survey respondents, or a greater portion of the survey respondents, said that Brazil remained the most attractive country in the region for oil and gas investments. As you say, none of the candidates are unknown to the market. Both both presidents are well known to the market. So a very interesting point there, and the survey backs that up. That leads into the next question. Brazil was the most popular choice for the best country for investments in oil and gas over the next 12 months. Do you agree with that sentiment, Carlos? And what are some of the other countries? I know you can't favor one country over the other because you represent all of Latin America and the Caribbean, but are there any markets in particular that stand out for you? I think Carlos is in.
Yes, and you mentioned in your survey that Brazil was first and it was second, and those are examples. You can hear me?
Yep, now we can hear you. Yep.
You mentioned about the result of the survey. Yeah, the results of the survey were Brazil first and Mexico second into the popular choices and for E&P, and that actually supports my point that prospectivity rules. So the rock, people see prospectivity, they're not so much concerned about political risk. You know, administrations normally come and go. Our investments are long term, and administrations often learn on the job too. In ARPEL, we don't run countries, and like I said, there are other markets, and I will keep my eye on Argentina. And the reason is that government, and it's besides prospectivity in Vaca, Muerta, which is spectacular, government and its main opportunity are very much aligned on hydrocarbon strategy. There's a division on many issues, but not on that one. Ecuador was frozen for a long time from foreign investment. Now it's opening up during an investment-friendly cycle. So I think there's a lot of untapped prospectivity there. And also Guyana and Suriname for obvious prospectivity reasons. So there are many points of light besides Brazil and Mexico.
Excellent, thank you, Carlos. Luiz, what are your thoughts about the region? Obviously, you know, Brazil is your focus, but your views about, I guess, the fact that Brazil is rated as the #1 country for oil and gas investment. Do you agree with that?
I think that Brazil has a kind of such a position because we already have a lot of very successful cases here in the country, and I think that we have all the conditions to keep moving ahead. But I think that even for Brazil, it's really important that the other countries in Latin America, especially in South America, they are able to develop their oil and gas market. It will be good for everyone. It's good for Brazil to have a good community in Argentina, in Chile, in Colombia, in Peru, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, because then we can try to solve one of, and in this case, in my opinion, it's a serious problem. There is the, let's say, the problems with the supply chain for the oil and gas markets. Because if we have a kind of, let's say, a more consistent market all over the continent here, I think that it will be much more interesting for investors, for suppliers, for companies that produce essential items for the operators to be installed here in South America or in Latin America, because they will kind of have a good market position, a good market to be developed, and it will make more sense to have, let's say, facilities and units here, located here in Latin America. So I think that the development of the other countries, it's pretty positive for Brazil. In my opinion, it's not a matter of competition for money. The lack of let's say, the potential lack of money that was pointed in the survey, I think that is much more related to fears that the investors have, what really causes the money to be much more expensive, and there is a certain concern on the other side from the oil and gas operators of having this, let's say, expensive money as, let's say, the fuel for their development. I think that the problem is not competing for these resources from investors. I don't think this is the case. I think that the case is that we should have a brighter, a bigger market here in the region make things even easier for all of us. You know, I think that we are here at Deloitte. We are talking to Deloitte Brazil. We are talking to Deloitte Colombia, Deloitte Argentina, and we are trying to cooperate and we are trying to exchange the experiences in order to offer a kind of let's say a good portfolio for these initiatives that we see that they are kind of blooming. You know, they are present in all of these countries that I mentioned before. So for us, I think that for Latin America in general, and I think from Argentina and from, let's say, from Patagonia to Mexico, I think that it would be good for all of us to have a kind of a bigger market, more consistent market in the whole continent.
Great, very interesting. Thank you, Luiz, for that response. We have a question from our audience related to Vaca Muerta in Argentina. Carlos, you spoke a little bit about Argentina in your last response. Maybe you can expand a little bit on why you think Argentina remains an attractive market for oil and gas investment. I know the government there has made efforts to create greater incentives to boost production, particularly of gas. What are your views of Vaca Muerta? Do you think that it can fulfill its potential?
I think it can. Of course, Vaca Muerta, had it been in Texas, it would be producing more than 1 million barrels a day by now. But the rock is incredible. It's probably the best shale in the world, and we have all the majors are investing there, and they all started with into the development, and it was pioneered by YPF. And there's no argument, internal argument in Argentina whether or not it has to be developed, and it has to be developed promptly. Of course, you know, like I said, things are easier in the US, but it's happening, and I think it is growing, and it's growing significantly, and it has been basically the risk. So I think I'm very bullish about Vaca Muerta.
Excellent. Thanks, Carlos. Very interesting. We have another question related to Venezuela, and we've seen reports that investments are, well, I guess the investments might not be flowing in Venezuela. It might be taking a little bit too far, but perhaps with the dollarization of the economy and the fact that Europe seems to be opening the doors again for its oil and gas companies to operate in Venezuela, that could lead perhaps to a partial reopening in a way of the oil and gas sector there. Do you have a view on that, Luiz or Carlos? How do you feel about the oil and gas sector in Venezuela? Is there hope there that perhaps things might be improving?
Yeah, in my opinion, I think that it would be great if Venezuela could come back as a kind of relevant player in the oil and gas market, the global oil and gas market. I'm quite sure that they will need to make a lot of investments because probably they have a lot of facilities and a lot of, let's say, installations that probably need to go through a kind of change, a kind of improvement, a kind of they need to invest, no doubt. But I think that this would be great, and no doubt that Venezuela, with the reserves they have, they would be essential for this idea that I have just brought to the table, that it's important for us to have all the countries, let's say as much as possible, all of the countries in a kind of good position. And I remember some time ago when Venezuela was still in good shape, that it was very good for South America in general. It was not something bad. It was good. I think that there is no reason for competition, let's say, between two countries or among the countries. It makes no sense. I think it's good because if they are there will be more services for companies from other countries, and I think that they will be exporting. We have a lot of positive things if they really come back to the, let's say, to the old shape, no doubt.
Very interesting. Thank you, Luiz. Carlos, what are your views? What is ARPEL's view about Venezuela? Are you seeing more interest in the country?
Yeah, yes, we're sensing more interest in the country, and what happened is that the situation with Russia made the world hit a real politic wall, and and I believe in the law of gravity. So I think there will be opportunities for Venezuela. It won't be instantaneous. It will take a while. But for example, Venezuela has, I don't remember exactly, but let's say 2/3 of the reserves of South America are in Venezuela, both oil and gas. And gas is very important now. Just imagine the synergy with Trinidad and Tobago, which is diminishing its production capacity, and it has transformation capacity both into LNG and petrochemicals with idle capacity. It just all it requires is to make a connection between Venezuela and Trinidad, and Trinidad could be a hub. So I think that would be great. That would be great for the gas industry, and so I'm optimistic that things may change regarding Venezuela.
Excellent, Carlos. Thank you. Another question we have from the audience is, how can private hydrocarbon companies be strengthened in the Latin American region in the face of the threat of rising food and energy prices that can lead to social chaos? I guess the underlying theme of this question is, how can the private sector be protected from the threat of protests and, I guess, social aversion to oil and gas? Do any of you have a view on that?
Well, in Latin America, I think, like in everywhere else, we have to regain the social license. For example, it was very curious that after 50 years of offshore industry in Argentina, when they announced a seismic campaign 300 kilometers from the shore, it became a big issue. And that was a wake-up call for the industry that we have to communicate better. Because how could it be? We've been doing for 50 years. It was never a problem, and now it became a problem. And and it's a problem of communication and perception. People think that shooting seismic 300 kilometers from the shore is going to ruin their beaches, and that is certainly not the case. But we have to learn as an industry to communicate, not among engineers and geologists. And take it for granted that people understand how the industry works. We have to do much better job in communicating in plain language. And I don't like to say educating, because that sounds patronizing. But I think we should listen, we should acknowledge, and we should communicate better. And we should maintain or regain the social license to keep our activities and to produce the energy that these same countries need to develop and to lift their big portions of their population from poverty.
Great, Carlos, thank you. What about you, Luiz? What are your thoughts on this, and what is the situation, the social situation in Brazil, in terms of what the public think about the perception of the oil and gas industry?
Yeah, I don't see a kind of situation there is kind of getting close to a chaos here. So I think that we don't experience this right now. But anyway, I think that the communication point that was raised by Carlos is a very important one. And the fact is that most of people, they do not understand exactly, or they do not know exactly what is behind the activity of the oil and gas industries. I think that people don't think that, oh, the fertilizers that all of us here in South America, we are facing a problem. We need to import the fertilizer from Russia, from Belarus. But the fact is that we could be producing at least part of them. I would say not potash, but at least the nitrogen fertilizers. They could be produced in Brazil using natural gas. They could be produced in the other countries of the continent. If there is one of the countries has a good potential in natural gas, it can be transformed into fertilizers, and it can be used to help in this problem of the food production. So I think that we need to let's say, to show this very in a very open way and to explain this. This is something that even the technical people sometimes do not know. even the technical guys, even the geologists, even the engineers, sometimes they do not make the connection, you know. And sometimes this is something that it's already being talked about. There is the using the natural gas as an ally of the renewables, like winds, like the sun power. I think that this is something that is already being understood, but it's something that needs to be reinforced too. And we shall keep in mind that if we think downstream, not only the oil and gas production, but if you think downstream, we have the for instance, Petrobras are selling. There is the new company operating the refinery in Salvador, Bahia. They are thinking about bringing kind of bioproducts into their line of products. They are not thinking only of, oh, we are only producing products that come from the dark oil that comes from the ocean. No, we are introducing some other elements. And so I think that there is a need to have this explained in a good way. And I think that we shall take initiatives like the conference that Carlos had just mentioned, and also the Rio Oil and Gas conference that will be in the next weeks here. I think that we shall use these big conferences as a kind of platform to launch these communication items to the public. Do you know?
Excellent, Luiz. Thanks for that response. We have time, I think, for one more question from the audience. It relates to Ecuador. I know, Carlos, you briefly mentioned Ecuador in one of your responses. The audience member says Ecuador is promoting at least 15 very important projects related to oil and gas. There is also a great project for the refining sector. Carlos and Luiz, could you provide us with your perception regarding investment in Ecuador? And I will just add to that Colombia, perhaps if you could, either of you or one of you could comment on Colombia as well. We know we don't want to talk too much about politics, but Colombia has made a big effort in recent years to attract the private sector in oil and gas. And I guess the question a lot of people will ask is if those investments will continue in the short to medium term. So perhaps, Carlos, you can begin.
Yeah, well, when we start by the main driver being prospectivity, I think Ecuador has a lot to offer. I think it's been underexplored and underdeveloped. That's why they're having these rounds in intracampos, between the big fields. People focus. Normally, you develop the big field first, and then don't do the fine tuning on the seismic to find all the satellite fields. So there's a lot of work to be done there. There's a lot of work to be done on the giant fields, and I think the current administration in Ecuador is doing its best to try to attract, but against there is a history of non-contract sanctity, and that needs to be. People need to trust that the pendulum will not swing wildly, and then they're going to have problems again, because companies get burned once and then they don't come back. But I think the combination of oil price prospectivity and the currency situation in Ecuador is quite compelling.
Great, thank you, Carlos. What are your thoughts about Ecuador and Colombia, Luiz?
Yeah, I think that I would like to take this, let's say, maybe the final question, I'm not sure, but to talk a little bit about refining, because you mentioned that at least one of the projects that was mentioned by the attendee was related to refining. I think that besides producing the oil, we also need to refine. One of the big problems in terms of inflation, in terms of let's say, the crisis we are facing right now, is related to the fact that most of the countries, they need to import the diesel oil, they need to import gasoline, so I think that having a good refining capacity in the continent is pretty strategic. It's a matter of security also. So I think that here in Brazil, we feel that for some time, and there was a reason for that, no criticism, but Petrobras was very focused in the oil and gas production, not that much in the refining sector. The margins in the refining sector, they were historically not very good, not as good as the upstream margins. But the fact is that nowadays we have a kind of different situation. It may not be a kind of permanent situation, it may be a moment, but I think that we can take advantage of this moment, and I think that Brazil is working on that, is trying to reorganize the refining sector here. Maybe depending on who is elected in Brazil, the solution will be in one direction or the other, but it doesn't matter. It's being fought, it's being considered. And I think that if there is any initiative in Ecuador right now on the refining sector, I think that this shall be reinforced. I have been talking to Colombia and to Argentina in the refining sector, talking to operators there, and there is a very, very good situation in both countries. We are talking about refineries that are very good refineries in both Colombia and Argentina. So I think that this is something that can be also good for Ecuador, in my opinion, and for the rest of the continent.
Thanks, Luiz. Just a quick follow-up question on that. We're running out of time, but perhaps, Carlos, you can just provide a little bit of color on the refining sector. I guess it's been a sector, as Luiz mentioned, the margins historically haven't been as high as the upstream sector, but we don't see that many new refinery projects in Latin America. It's been a long time. I know there's Talada in Ecuador and there's Dos Bocas in Mexico, but do you see perhaps potential for investments in refineries in Latin America in the coming years?
I see them driven more by national needs, and you know, the refining sector is very sensitive to energy transition. You know, what's going to happen with electric cars, and what happens when even the petrochemical industry, when consumer companies say they don't want to use they don't want to use carbon-based products to make their own products, which I think it's kind of silly, because I understand not wanting to burn, you know, in a combustion engine for people to drive a car, but what about adding value and transforming it into materials that are in intermediate materials? That makes a lot of sense. So you know, I think the refining sector is in a challenge, and they need to think, and they need to plan, and they need to think how they're going to adapt.
Great, very insightful comments, Carlos and Luiz. Thank you both of you for joining us today. We're run out of time, but we really appreciate you joining in this panel. And with that, I'll pass it back to our content director, Cesar Liano. Cesar, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carlos, Luiz, and Michael, for this panel. It's been a great conversation. I again remind all BNamericas clients that you can read and download our oil and gas survey report in our platform. For those of you who are not yet clients, I invite you to visit BNamericas.com and check out the content that we publish every day. Thank you very much again. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.